A mother of 3 stands in the hallway of her farmhouse. At her feet lies a dead man shot 9 times with 2 different handguns. She tells the 911 dispatcher a terrifying story of a home invasion and a desperate fight to protect her children. It sounds like the ultimate act of maternal survival, but the evidence tells a much darker story. The man on the floor wasn't a violent intruder. He was a vulnerable 20-year-old neighbor, a naive pawn cast in a lethal theatrical production, meticulously directed by a woman willing to execute an innocent just to win a custody battle. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To comprehend the absolute carnage of that December night, it is necessary to rewind and examine the architect of the illusion. Long before the frantic emergency dispatch, Tracey Higgins was a masterclass in psychological camouflage. Born with an intensely calculating intellect, she possessed a predatory ability to read people, identify their emotional blind spots, and mirror their desires. She was not just charismatic, she was whatever her target needed her to be. This chameleon-like quality easily captivated Dr. John Pittman, an ambitious medical student on the fast track to becoming a highly lucrative plastic surgeon. To him, she appeared to be the ultimate professional and personal asset, articulate, fiercely driven, and impeccably polished. They married, inextricably binding his rising medical trajectory to her insatiable drive for status and control. The couple eventually relocated to Virginia, acquiring a sprawling multi-million-dollar estate. It was a physical monument to upper-class success, complete with manicured acreage, sweeping mahogany staircases, and heavy velvet drapes designed to keep the prying eyes of the outside world completely at bay. On paper, they were the golden couple of their elite social circle. But behind the heavy oak doors, the atmosphere was genuinely suffocating. The air inside the house felt chronically stale, thick with the metallic tang of unspoken hostility and sudden, explosive interrogations. The surgeon later described the marriage to authorities as a psychological prison. He detailed how his wife did not merely argue, but waged calculated campaigns of mental attrition. She required absolute submission. Her need for control manifested in deeply obsessive behaviors. She actively isolated him from his longtime colleagues, covertly monitored his private communications, and constructed a deeply fractured reality where she was perpetually the victim of unseen, malicious conspiracies. The birth of their oldest son escalated the domestic tension from merely toxic to overtly dangerous. In her hands, the child was not simply a life to be nurtured. He was the ultimate leverage, a tangible asset to be weaponized. When the doctor finally recognized the depth of the psychological decay and filed for separation, the legal warfare that followed was spectacular in its bitterness. The courtroom simply became her new theater. She made it clear to her legal team that she did not just want to dissolve the marriage. She intended to entirely annihilate her ex-husband's professional reputation, his financial standing, and his basic sanity. During the protracted custody proceedings, a terrifying pattern of behavior emerged, a direct blueprint for the lethal violence she would later unleash. If the legal system hesitated to rule in her favor, she simply manufactured a new, more extreme reality to force their hand. She initiated a relentless barrage of official police reports against the doctor. Law enforcement would routinely arrive at the Virginia estate to find her trembling, offering highly detailed, seemingly credible accounts of physical abuse, stalking, and sustained harassment. She spun elaborate, paranoid tales to federal and local investigators, firmly claiming her ex-husband was deeply embedded in a criminal syndicate and was actively hiring underground contract killers to eliminate her. Detectives spent hundreds of hours chasing down these sensational claims, sifting through the wreckage of her allegations. Yet, the physical evidence stubbornly refused to materialize. The bruises she pointed to were medically inconsistent. The threatening phone calls remained completely untraceable. The alleged hitmen were entirely phantom. It slowly became evident to both the local authorities and the family court judges that they were dealing with a highly sophisticated fabricator. Her ex-husband testified under oath that he was legitimately terrified of her, noting that her ability to lie with total, unwavering conviction was clinical in its execution. Despite the relentless character assassination, the court ultimately granted joint custody of the boy. For the exhausted surgeon, it was a hard-fought victory that cost him a massive fortune in legal fees and left him emotionally hollowed out. He retreated, attempting to quietly rebuild his medical practice and find some semblance of peace, desperately hoping that vast physical distance would dilute the toxicity of his former partner. He severely underestimated her resolve. For a mind addicted to absolute dominance, a former target slipping the leash was an unforgivable offense. Sharing custody meant she was legally forced to share control, and that was a condition she simply could not tolerate. If the courts in Virginia refused to strip the father of his parental rights, she calculated that she needed a new venue, a completely new jurisdiction where her extensive history of false police reports and perjury was entirely unknown. Packing up her life and securing her son, she fled the East Coast, driving over 1,000 miles away to the rural, windswept plains of the Midwest. She required a blank slate. She settled in a tiny farming community, a place defined by its quiet isolation, unlocked doors, and inherently trusting neighbors. It was the perfect stage, completely devoid of the skeptical scrutiny she had left behind. Here, she could rewrite her personal narrative, cast new supporting characters, and begin quietly laying the groundwork for a far more permanent, irreversible solution to her ongoing custody problem. Early, Iowa sits surrounded by endless, rigid grids of cornfields and soybean plots. It is a place where freezing winter winds tear uninterrupted across the plains, a town of barely 600 residents where front doors are left unlocked and outsiders are noticed immediately. For a woman fleeing the suffocating scrutiny of East Coast family courts, this profound isolation was not a punishment. It was a distinct tactical advantage. Here, the slate was wiped completely clean. She quickly identified her next necessary asset, a local tech entrepreneur. He possessed the exact qualities she required to rebuild her fortress: financial stability, a respectable social standing, and a deeply trusting nature. Their courtship was brief, efficient, and entirely on her terms. They married quickly, moving into one of the more prominent homes in the small community. To the locals, she presented herself as a devoted mother, simply seeking a quiet Midwestern life. But inside the walls of that house, the old paranoia was violently taking root once again. The geographical distance of over 1,000 miles had not deterred the surgeon back in Virginia. He continued his legal fight, filing aggressive motions and demanding his parental rights. The courts back east were finally beginning to see through her previous fabrications. The family judge was growing increasingly intolerant of her erratic behavior and her sudden cross-country flight with the child. The legal momentum was shifting dramatically. Rulings were coming down against her. The terrifying reality began to set in. She was on the verge of losing primary custody. For a mind wired for absolute dominance, defeat was simply not an option. A standard allegation of harassment would no longer suffice. The legal system was deaf to her usual complaints. She needed a nuclear option. She needed an undeniable physical manifestation of the phantom threats she had spent years weaving. She required an actual hitman, or at least someone who could be dressed up as one. Dustin Wehde lived just a few blocks away. He was 20 years old, physically grown, but cognitively anchored in early adolescence. He suffered from severe learning disabilities and developmental delays. His daily life was defined by a desperate, heartbreaking desire to be liked and accepted. He struggled heavily with social nuances, often misreading cues, and carried a naive eagerness to please any adult who showed him a sliver of respect. She spotted him in the neighborhood. To the rest of the town, Dustin was just a harmless, slow young man who occasionally needed help navigating complex tasks. To her, he was the perfect raw material. The grooming process was remarkably subtle, a masterclass in predatory manipulation. It began with casual, friendly interactions across the property line. She hired him for simple, odd jobs, having him shovel snow, mow the lawn, and move heavy boxes into the basement. He was thrilled to have the work and the extra pocket money. But more importantly, he was thrilled by the validation. She paid him generously, far more than the physical labor warranted. She invited him inside, offering cold drinks and a sympathetic ear. She became an authoritative yet maternal figure in his highly limited world. Through these interactions, she meticulously mapped his psychological landscape. She tested his boundaries, noting how he accepted her instructions without a single question. She realized that his developmental delays made him incredibly literal. If she told him something was true, he believed it entirely. Her new husband remained completely oblivious to the tightening coil within his own home. He was a man consumed by his growing tech enterprise, frequently traveling across state lines to secure contracts. When he was home, he served as a convenient, respectable backdrop to her meticulously curated suburban facade. He paid the bills, maintained the property, and provided the veneer of a stable household. He did not ask pressing questions about her past, nor did he scrutinize her intense, whispered phone calls with her legal team. He accepted her at face value, completely unaware that his wife was currently casting a deadly production in their living room. As the freezing Iowa winter set in, the pressure from the Virginia courts reached a critical mass. The deadline was looming. If she did not produce hard evidence of her ex-husband's murderous intentions soon, she would lose her son. The script in her head was finalized, and she now had her lead actor. She began feeding Dustin a deeply convoluted narrative. She told him she was in grave danger from terrible people back east. She leveraged his protective instincts, his desire to be a hero, and his sheer inability to grasp the severe consequences of extreme actions. She requested strange favors, sitting him down and having him write out specific phrases in a pink spiral notebook she provided. She dictated the exact words, ensuring the handwriting was undeniably his own. He complied, likely believing it was a game, a writing exercise, or a secret mission to help the kind woman who paid him so well. The notebook was the cornerstone of her entire illusion. In its pages, under her strict direction, Dustin scrawled a bizarre, disjointed confession. The text explicitly claimed that a mysterious doctor from Virginia had hired him to break into the house and execute the mother. It was a clumsy, amateurish document, riddled with spelling errors and logical gaps. Exactly what one would expect from a developmentally delayed 20-year-old. But to her, it was the ultimate insurance policy. By mid-December, the stage was entirely set. Her husband was out of town on business, leaving her alone in the large house with the children. The Midwestern isolation was absolute. The neighborhood was quiet. The pink journal was secured in Dustin's car. She only needed to summon her unwitting extra for his final scene. She called Dustin over on a cold, dark evening, under the guise of another simple household chore. He walked out of his home, entirely unaware that he was stepping onto a highly orchestrated, lethal film set. He was not walking into a neighbor's house to help set up a computer or move a couch. He was walking into his own execution. The ambient temperature outside the farmhouse hovered near 0 degrees Fahrenheit on the evening of December 13th, 2001. A brutal Midwestern cold snap had descended over the rural plains, freezing the topsoil solid and ensuring that the vast stretches of surrounding acreage remained entirely devoid of foot traffic. The severe weather created a natural, impenetrable perimeter around the property. Inside the sprawling home, the environment was highly controlled. The tech entrepreneur was miles away on a business trip. The 3 children were secured in their bedrooms for the night. The stage was set. The audience of one was completely isolated, and the director was finally ready to call action. The 20-year-old neighbor made the short, freezing trek across the property line. His trusting nature and eager compliance blinded him to the heavy, suffocating tension waiting behind the front door. He stepped inside, shaking the snow from his boots, likely expecting another mundane chore, moving a heavy piece of furniture or organizing boxes in the basement. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, severing his final connection to the safety of the outside world. He was no longer a helpful neighbor. He was a trapped prop in a lethal, manufactured narrative. The transition from quiet suburban evening to absolute auditory violence was instantaneous. It was not a chaotic, sudden panic. The forensic reality suggested a prolonged, methodical execution. The primary weapon introduced into the tight hallway was a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. The first sharp, deafening cracks of gunfire echoed brutally off the plaster walls. The sheer concussive force of discharging a high-velocity firearm inside a confined residential corridor is physically disorienting, leaving a thick, acrid cloud of burned sulfur and cordite hanging stagnant in the air. The initial impacts drove the young man down, but a few rounds from a 9mm were insufficient to sell the elaborate story she had engineered. She required the visual and auditory evidence of a desperate life-or-death shootout, a chaotic struggle against multiple, heavily armed assailants. She retrieved a second weapon, a massive .357 Magnum revolver. The auditory profile of a Magnum discharging indoors is a concussive boom that shakes the floorboards. She leveled the heavy revolver and continued to pull the trigger. She unloaded into a young man who was already incapacitated on the carpet. 9 bullets in total tore through flesh, shattered bone, and embedded themselves deep into the surrounding drywall and subflooring. The overpenetration was staggering, designed to simulate a frantic, blind firefight in the dark. When the firing pin finally clicked on an empty cylinder, a heavy, ringing silence settled over the house. The smell of copper and smoke was overpowering, but the performance was only half complete. A bloody hallway and a dead body were merely the physical aftermath. She needed the psychological framing. The director went to work setting her stage. She retrieved a pair of synthetic nylon pantyhose. Wrapping the incredibly tough fabric tight around her own throat, she pulled with immense force. She choked herself just long enough to burst the blood vessels beneath the skin, leaving brutal, highly visible red ligature marks deep in the tissue of her neck. She ruffled her clothing, disturbed the furniture in the adjacent master bedroom to simulate a violent physical struggle, and then reached for the telephone. The audio recording of the emergency dispatch call that followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Her breathing over the line was ragged, perfectly pitched to project maximum terror. She hyperventilated into the receiver, her voice breaking at precisely the right moments to secure the dispatcher's total sympathy. She screamed through the connection that she had just killed a man to save her sleeping children. She reported that 2 shadowy intruders had violently breached her home. Over the open line, she delivered her highly rehearsed script, detailing how these unknown men had ambushed her in the darkness, wrapped pantyhose tightly around her neck, and mercilessly cut off her oxygen supply. She explained, her voice trembling with manufactured trauma, that the intruders had explicitly threatened to torture and kill the children in the next room. She described a superhuman burst of maternal adrenaline. She told the operator she had managed to fight through the strangulation, break free from the 2 men, and sprint down the hall to a locked gun safe. She claimed she frantically retrieved the 9mm pistol and opened fire to protect her family. Anticipating the physical evidence of the 2 different calibers, she proactively wove the anomaly into her story. She told the dispatcher the semi-automatic had jammed midway through the firefight. She detailed how she threw the useless weapon aside, desperately grabbed the .357 revolver, and continued firing blindly into the shadows to stop the brutal attack. She insisted the second intruder had fled back into the freezing night, leaving his accomplice bleeding out on the linoleum. Local deputies tore down the icy county roads, their sirens slicing through the quiet farmland. When first responders breached the front entrance, they were met with absolute sensory overload. The thermostat was working overtime against the draft from the open doors, circulating the heavy, metallic stench of fresh blood and discharged firearms. They found her huddled in the living room, weeping uncontrollably, clutching her battered throat. The deep, raw abrasions from the nylon were starkly visible under the harsh glare of tactical flashlights. Deputies moved past her with weapons drawn, sweeping the residence room by room. In the hallway, they confronted the grisly reality of the scene. The young neighbor lay dead in a massive, expanding pool of viscosity. The sheer amount of trauma inflicted upon him was horrific. Brass casings were scattered haphazardly across the floor, catching the light, while the walls were splintered and cratered from erratic gunfire. Officers located the 3 children unharmed, pulling them from their beds and carrying them past the bloody corridor. The visual of bewildered kids being evacuated by armed men in uniform perfectly solidified the absolute chaos she had engineered to cement her status as a protective victim. Paramedics loaded her into an ambulance, where she continued to breathlessly repeat her harrowing tale of the home invasion to every uniform she saw. Outside, K-9 units were deployed into the bitter snow, desperately hunting for the footprints of a phantom second suspect that simply did not exist. The initial impression on the local police force was profound sympathy. They saw a terrified, abused mother who had engaged in horrific violence solely to shield her family from monsters. But as the adrenaline of the breach faded and the crime scene technicians stepped into the hallway under glaring halogen work lights, the meticulously arranged set began to whisper a different, profoundly disturbing story. The bullet angles were severely wrong. The spacing of the physical struggle was entirely impossible. And the blood pooling on the carpet was completely stagnant in places where it should have been smeared by a frantic fight for survival. The initial wave of sympathy from local law enforcement evaporated almost the moment crime scene investigators began analyzing the blood-soaked hallway. Physical evidence is notoriously stubborn. It does not bend to manufactured emotion, nor does it care for theatrical tears. The forensics team immediately noted glaring, insurmountable contradictions between the homeowner's frantic narrative and the rigid geometry of the violence. She had described a chaotic, desperate, close-quarters struggle for her life, firing blindly while fending off two grown men. Yet the blood spatter patterns painted an entirely different, chillingly static picture. The velocity and trajectory of the droplets indicated the victim was entirely stationary, likely already incapacitated on the floor, when the vast majority of the fatal shots were fired. The downward angles of the bullet tracks through flesh and drywall completely shattered the illusion of a desperate, upward struggle. There were no cast-off stains on the walls to suggest a frantic, standing grapple. The violence here was entirely one-sided. Furthermore, the abrasive wounds on her neck, the supposed absolute proof of a lethal strangulation attempt, were far too perfect. Experienced detectives recognized the distinct, uniform horizontal banding left by the nylon hosiery. When a desperate attacker attempts to strangle a resisting victim from behind, the violent thrashing inevitably causes the ligature to slip, scrape violently, and angle upward toward the ears as the victim drops their chin to protect their airway. Her marks were perfectly level, sitting uniformly across her throat, a classic, undeniable hallmark of a self-inflicted injury. She had methodically wrapped the pantyhose around her own neck, pulled tight, and held the tension there just long enough to permanently bruise the superficial tissue before calling dispatch. Investigators then turned their attention to the perimeter. The homeowner vehemently insisted a second, heavily armed intruder had fled the premises immediately after the initial gunfire erupted. The temperature outside hovered near 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and a fresh, heavy layer of snow blanketed the rural property. It was the ultimate forensic trap. If a man had sprinted from that front door into the dead of winter, he would have left a highly visible trail of deep, frantic footprints in the crisp powder. Sheriff's deputies and K-9 units scoured the exterior of the house for hours under the harsh, sweeping glare of halogen floodlights. The snow remained entirely undisturbed. There were no fleeing tire tracks in the long driveway, no broken branches in the bordering tree line, no crushed frost. The perimeter was absolutely pristine. The second assassin simply did not exist. Despite the mounting physical anomalies, the investigation desperately needed a logical motive to connect the grieving mother to the execution of her developmentally delayed neighbor. That missing link materialized when detectives executed a search warrant on the dead man's vehicle, which was parked quietly in his own driveway just down the road. Hidden inside the car, investigators discovered a bright pink spiral notebook. It was a jarring juvenile item to find in the possession of an adult male. Inside its ruled pages was a handwritten manifesto that read like a poorly constructed, low-budget espionage thriller. The sprawling, error-riddled text contained a highly specific confession. The author explicitly claimed that a wealthy surgeon from the East Coast had approached him, offering him $10,000 to break into the Midwestern farmhouse and commit a contract killing. The journal carefully detailed the supposed hit, explicitly framing the victim as an assassin for hire and naming the ex-husband as the mastermind. To the seasoned detectives reading it in the freezing driveway, the document was highly absurd. The handwriting unquestionably belonged to the deceased, but the complex terminology, the specific legal names, and the structure of the conspiracy matched the exact, paranoid vocabulary used by the woman sitting in the back of the ambulance. It became instantly terrifyingly clear. The young man had simply acted as a human dictation machine. He had sat down with her, eager to help his friendly neighbor, and wrote down whatever she instructed him to write. He had penned his own fake murder-for-hire contract, completely unaware he was essentially signing his own death warrant to provide a physical prop for her ongoing custody battle thousands of miles away. This discovery should have been the undeniable catalyst for an immediate arrest. However, the complex realities of small-town justice began to heavily influence the trajectory of the case. When news of the shooting broke across the quiet farming community, the social echo was immense and deeply polarizing. The tight-knit town was completely unequipped to handle a psychological thriller of this magnitude. Paranoia and rumors tore through the local diner and the church pews like a virus. Half the town viewed the survivor as a fiercely protective mother who had valiantly defended her terrified children against a genuine threat. They pointed to the pink notebook as absolute proof of the ex-husband's vast, sinister conspiracy. The other half looked at the dead 20-year-old, a gentle kid everyone knew struggled to tie his own shoes or hold a complex conversation, and found it completely impossible to believe he was capable of orchestrating a violent home invasion. The local prosecutor found himself caught in a massive political and legal quagmire. Presenting a highly circumstantial case against an attractive, weeping mother of 3 to a rural jury was considered a massive career risk. The physical evidence strongly pointed toward a staged, cold-blooded execution, but the sheer audacity of the crime made it incredibly difficult for a conservative jury pool to rationally accept. Proving a mother slaughtered a disabled kid just to win a civil family court dispute was a mountain the local authorities were terrified to climb. Hesitation paralyzed the county system. Days turned into weeks, and weeks bled into agonizing months. The investigation quietly stalled. The yellow crime scene tape was eventually pulled down, the bullet holes in the hallway drywall were patched over, and the master manipulator remained entirely free. The case officially went cold, leaving a devastated family to bury their son in the frozen earth, while the architect of his demise simply packed her bags and moved on, entirely unpunished, ready to unleash her brand of chaos on whoever dared cross her next. The transition from an active, bleeding crime scene to a dormant cold case is rarely marked by a sudden cinematic door slam. Instead, it is a slow, quiet suffocation of momentum. The county justice system simply backed away from the explosive political optics of charging a sobbing mother. The physical evidence, the mismatched ballistic trajectories, the twisted nylon pantyhose, the deeply absurd pink spiral notebook, was methodically cataloged, boxed in heavy cardboard, and shoved onto a metal rack in a climate-controlled archive room. The harsh metallic smell of discharged cordite slowly faded, replaced by the dry, sterile scent of aging paper and institutional neglect. For nearly a decade, dust settled undisturbed over the slaughtered 20-year-old's files. The legal heartbeat of the investigation flatlined completely. But a psychological predator rarely enters a state of true hibernation. The need for absolute dominance requires constant friction, a perpetual enemy to fight. With the immediate threat of the East Coast custody battle neutralized by the sheer gravity of a dead body in her hallway, the architect of the violence required a new adversary. Without an external target, she inevitably turned her sights on the closest available asset, the man sleeping in her own bed. The marriage to the Midwestern tech entrepreneur began a rapid, deeply familiar descent into toxicity. The quiet suburban fortress transformed back into an active psychological war zone. Her familiar patterns of isolation and combat re-emerged with terrifying precision. She began severely restricting his access to shared finances, covertly monitoring his daily movements, and planting insidious seeds of doubt among his local business associates. When he finally recognized the staggering depths of the manipulation and attempted to legally separate, she unleashed the exact same playbook she had utilized against the surgeon years prior. She filed a relentless barrage of emergency protective orders. She routinely contacted local deputies, claiming her current husband was physically violent, highly unstable, and secretly plotting to destroy her. She attempted to aggressively frame him for severe financial crimes, fabricating digital trails and forging documents to ruin his burgeoning enterprise. However, she made a critical, highly arrogant miscalculation. She was deploying a psychological strategy against a man who built his entire professional career on digital architecture and data verification. He did not just retreat, he began quietly collecting his own evidence, meticulously archiving her erratic behaviors and securing his digital networks against her continuous sabotage. He barely survived the brutal divorce, legally severing ties, but he walked away carrying a massive, heavy burden of suspicion regarding the bloody events of December 2001. He knew firsthand the absolute lengths to which she would go to manufacture a victim narrative. While she busied herself destroying her second marriage, the calendar slowly turned to 2010. The political landscape of the county had quietly shifted. A new, highly aggressive prosecuting attorney took office, completely unburdened by the previous administration's profound fear of public backlash. This new legal team decided to systematically audit the archives. They pulled the heavy cardboard boxes down from the metal shelves, cracking the brittle, yellowing evidence tape. Fresh eyes fell upon the crime scene photographs, analyzing them without the blinding filter of local sympathy. The laws of physics had not altered over the intervening 9 years. The blood spatter on the hallway carpet still indicated a stationary, prone victim. The downward trajectory of the heavy magnum rounds still proved the shooter stood directly over an incapacitated target. The red ligature marks still sat far too uniformly across the throat to be the genuine result of a dynamic, violent struggle from behind. The initial red herrings that had previously paralyzed the local police were forcefully dismantled. The phantom second intruder was entirely dismissed as a calculated fiction, unsupported by a single crushed snowflake or footprint in the winter perimeter. The pink journal was finally recognized not as the raving blueprint of a hired East Coast assassin, but as the pathetic, dictated homework of a heavily manipulated, cognitively impaired kid trying to please his neighbor. The most devastating breakthrough, however, arrived entirely from the shadows. The tech entrepreneur, having watched his ex-wife leave a massive trail of unpunished destruction, officially stepped forward as a cooperating witness. He met behind closed doors with the new investigative team. He detailed the sheer psychological terror of living with her, describing a woman addicted to manufacturing high-stakes trauma. But his most lethal contribution to the reopening of the case was purely digital. He informed the detectives that, during the collapse of their marriage, he had utilized his professional expertise to quietly audit the household computer networks. He had pulled the hidden, deeply buried internet logs and cached data from the era leading up to the fatal shooting. He described finding a chilling digital footprint. Months before the young neighbor was lured into the hallway, the IP address registered to their home had been used to conduct highly specific predatory research. There were detailed queries on how to effectively bypass residential security alarms. There were extensive searches exploring the exact legal definitions of justifiable homicide and the parameters of the Castle Doctrine within their specific state jurisdiction. Most damning of all, the digital forensic trail showed a keen, sustained interest in the anatomical mechanics of strangulation, specifically exploring exactly how much pressure was required to leave deep bruising without crushing the human windpipe. The authorities now possessed a terrifying, cohesive timeline. It was no longer just a collection of mismatched blood spatter and a highly unbelievable story. They had a proven, documented pattern of extreme fabrication. They had the digital blueprints of a premeditated snare. They had the sworn testimony of a surviving ex-husband who intimately understood her boundless capacity for cold-blooded deceit. The protective shell of the traumatized mother had completely dissolved. Investigators methodically built an ironclad framework around her. They re-interviewed the original responding paramedics, forcing them to look past the manufactured tears and focus solely on the physical mechanics of her injuries. They brought in advanced behavioral analysts to dissect the 2001 emergency dispatch recording, breaking down the pitch, pacing, and artificial desperation in her voice. The experts concluded the audio was not a genuine plea for help. It was a theatrical performance. It was a woman hyperventilating not from the adrenaline of a near-death experience, but from the physical exertion of selling an incredibly complex, high-stakes lie over a telephone wire. The net was drawn completely tight. The decade-long freeze was officially over. The local authorities drafted a comprehensive arrest warrant, meticulously outlining the extreme lengths a predator had gone to permanently frame her first husband by sacrificing a vulnerable boy. The elaborate conspiracies and the desperate home invasion were finally dragged out of the dark and exposed as the lethal stage props they truly were. In late 2011, a full decade after the execution in the hallway, authorities finally closed the trap. Tracey was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The courtroom became her final failing stage. The prosecution meticulously dismantled her illusion piece by piece, presenting the static blood spatter, the impossible bullet trajectories, and the pristine snow perimeter. They introduced digital forensics, proving she had methodically researched how to inflict non-lethal ligature marks on her own throat. The most devastating element was the pink spiral notebook. The state argued it was not a hitman's confession, but a dictated suicide note penned by a highly vulnerable young man eager to please a manipulative neighbor. She had lured him inside, ordered him to document a fictional conspiracy targeting her ex-husband, and then slaughtered him as a disposable prop. The jury saw entirely through the manufactured tears. Deliberations were swift, resulting in a guilty verdict. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole, permanently stripped of the one thing she craved above all else: absolute control. Dustin Wehde's fatal mistake was simply an earnest desire to be useful. His trusting nature made him the perfect, tragic prop in a lethal play he never comprehended. His life extinguished solely because a manipulator needed a physical body to anchor a lie. Today, Tracey Richter sits in an Iowa state penitentiary. Her meticulously crafted scripts, her phantom assassins and dramatic dispatch calls are permanently silenced. The ultimate director finally built a snare she could not talk her way out of, a locked steel cage entirely stripped of her audience, where the only narrative left is the cold reality of her own guilt. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.